The first time I realized an entire neighborhood had been built on my family and Oppo's land, I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain simply refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. There were children riding bicycles down freshly paved streets, moving trucks unloading furniture into luxury homes, landscapers trimming hedges around decorative fountains, and right in the middle of all of it stood a massive stone entrance sign that read, and quote, Cedar Heights Estates, end quote. The problem was, 3 years earlier, that exact spot had been covered in pine trees. My pine trees. My grandfather and Oppo's pine trees. 74 acres of family land that had supposedly been sitting untouched while I handled work, family problems, and everything else life likes to throw at you when you and Oppo's not paying attention. I sat inside my truck staring through the windshield for nearly 10 minutes before finally stepping out. Every instinct told me there had to be some mistake. Maybe I entered the wrong coordinates. Maybe I misunderstood the property boundaries. Maybe somebody had purchased neighboring land and I was overreacting. But deep down, before I even checked the records, I already knew something was wrong. My name is Ethan Mercer. I and Oppo's am 48 years old, a civil engineer by trade, divorced, stubborn, and according to my daughter, physically incapable of throwing away paperwork. That last habit ended up saving me. My grandfather, Henry Mercer, bought that mountain property back in 1978 when nobody wanted it. There was no development nearby, no tourism industry, no million-dollar homes. Just forest, wildlife, and a small creek winding through the valley. People thought he was crazy. He spent decades maintaining trails, protecting the land, paying taxes every year without fail. Before he died, he handed me a weathered metal box filled with deeds, surveys, tax receipts, and handwritten notes. End quote. One day somebody will tell you this land ISN and Oppo's yours, end quote, he said. End quote. When that day comes, let the paper do the talking. End quote. At the time, I thought it was just old man wisdom. Looking back, I think Grandpa saw the future better than any of us. As I approached the entrance gate, a security guard stepped out of a small booth and raised a hand. End quote. Residents only. End quote. I pointed toward the neighborhood behind him. End quote. Who developed this? End quote. End quote. Silvercrest Communities. End quote. End quote. When? End quote. He looked confused. End quote. Over the last 3 years, I guess. End quote. 3 years. Exactly the same period I hadn't and Oppo's visited the property. My stomach tightened. I pulled up county records on my phone. Parcel number, tax account, ownership history. Everything still showed my family and Oppo's name. Every single document. Every tax payment. Every survey. Nothing indicated a sale. Nothing indicated a transfer. Nothing indicated permission for development. Yet 96 completed homes stood right in front of me. Before I could process any of it, a black luxury SUV rolled through the gate. The driver parked near us, and a woman stepped out wearing designer sunglasses, an expensive blazer, and the kind of confidence that comes from spending years believing consequences only happen to other people. Her name was Victoria Langford. At least that and Oppo's. That's what I and Oppo's am calling her. She was president of the Homeowners Association and one of the most influential people connected to the development. The moment she saw me standing there, she immediately assumed I didn't and Oppo's belong. Funny how often powerful people make that mistake. End quote. Is there a problem? End quote. She asked. The security guard pointed at me. End quote. He says he owns the land. End quote. Victoria actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a surprised laugh. A dismissive one. The kind rich people use when they think reality is negotiable. End quote. Sir, end quote. She said, smiling, end quote. This community was legally approved years ago. End quote. End quote. Interesting, end quote. I replied. End quote. Because county records still show me as the owner. End quote. Her smile faded slightly. I held up the digital deed on my phone. Then I showed her the tax records. Then the survey maps. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. Not scared. Just annoyed. Like I and Oppo's interrupted her day with an inconvenience she expected somebody else to handle. End quote. You should speak with the developer, end quote, she said. End quote. Already planning to, end quote, end quote. Good. Because these homeowners purchased their properties legally, end quote. I looked past her toward the neighborhood. Kids playing basketball, families walking dogs, elderly couples gardening. None of them knew they were standing in the middle of a legal disaster. And honestly, that and Apos. When I realized who the real victims were. Not me, not the developer, the families. The people who spent their life savings buying homes they believed were secure. Somebody had lied to them. Somebody had sold them a dream built on a foundation of fraud. Victoria crossed her arms. And quote, let me guess. You and Apos, hoping for a settlement. And quote, no and quote, compensation, and quote, no and quote. Then what exactly do you want? End quote. I looked directly at her. End quote. The truth. End quote. She stared at me for several seconds. Then she smiled again. But this time it wasn't Apos, confidence. It was calculation. End quote. You know, end quote. She said quietly, end quote. People make a lot of claims when property values go up. End quote. That sentence told me everything. She didn't end Apos, think I had proof. She thought I was bluffing. She thought she could intimidate me into disappearing before I became a problem. What she didn't end Apos, know was that my grandfather spent 40 years teaching me patience. And patience is dangerous when it and Apos paired with evidence. As I walked back toward my truck, I noticed construction crews still working on the final section of the community. New homes were being finished. New buyers were moving in. New contracts were being signed every week. Most people would and Apos, rushed straight to court. Most people would and Apos, tried stopping construction immediately. I almost did. Then another thought entered my mind. A much colder thought. If I stopped the project now, the damage would be limited. But if I waited, if I quietly gathered every document, every survey, every permit, every signature, every fraudulent transaction, and allowed them to finish what they and Apos started, the consequences would become exponentially worse. I climbed into my truck and glanced one last time at the neighborhood built on my family and Apos' land. 96 homes, hundreds of residents, tens of millions of dollars invested. Victoria stood near the gate watching me leave with a satisfied smile, convinced she and Apos just scared off another nuisance. She had no idea she was watching the beginning of the biggest mistake of her life. And as I drove away, I made a decision that would eventually send lawyers, developers, HOA board members, and county officials into absolute panic. Because I wasn't Apos going to stop them from finishing construction, I was going to let them finish every single house first. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't Apos call a lawyer. I didn't Apos contact the media. I didn't Apos file an injunction. And that decision drove people absolutely crazy once they learned the full story. Looking back, I understand why. Most people think justice means acting immediately. They see a problem and want a confrontation. They want sirens, court orders, dramatic speeches. What they don't and Apos understand is that sometimes the strongest move is doing nothing at all, at least for a little while. Every day after work, I sat at my dining room table surrounded by property records, survey maps, tax receipts, county filings, and old notebooks my grandfather had left behind. At first, I was just trying to understand how something this massive could happen. 96 homes didn't and Apos accidentally appear on somebody else and Apos' land. Entire departments had approved this project. Surveyors had signed documents. Engineers had reviewed plans. Attorneys had processed transactions. Banks had financed mortgages. County officials had issued permits. Somewhere inside that chain, somebody either made an unbelievable mistake or somebody knowingly ignored the truth. The deeper I dug, the less I liked what I found. One document led to another, then another, then another. A boundary adjustment filed 6 years earlier contained measurements that didn't and Apos match historical surveys. A revised parcel map referenced coordinates that physically couldn't and Apos exist. One approval form included signatures from officials who weren't and Apos even employed by the county at the time listed on the document. Every answer created 3 new questions, and every question pointed toward the same conclusion. This wasn't Apos a simple error. Somebody had built an entire development on paperwork that looked legitimate until you examined it closely. About a month after my first visit, I hired an attorney named Rachel Pierce. Rachel was the kind of lawyer who scared people without raising her voice. Smart, patient. End quote. Either this is one of the largest property mistakes I and Oppos V ever seen, end quote, she said quietly, end quote, or somebody committed fraud on a truly impressive scale, end quote, end quote. Which do you think? End quote. She smiled slightly. End quote. I and Oppos am hoping it and Oppos S a mistake. Because if it and Oppos S fraud, a lot of people are about to have very bad years, end quote. Over the following weeks, Rachel assembled a team. Survey experts, title specialists, property law consultants, former county officials. One by one, they reviewed the records. One by one, they reached the same conclusion. My ownership claim was legitimate. The original deed chain remained intact. Tax payments never stopped. No legal transfer existed. No valid sale occurred. Somehow, despite all that, millions of dollars of real estate transactions had been completed on land that still legally belonged to me. Then came the most shocking discovery. The development company, Ridgeway Communities, had already sold nearly every home. Families had invested their savings. Banks had issued mortgages worth tens of millions of dollars. The HOA collected dues. The city maintained infrastructure connections. Everybody acted as though ownership had been settled years ago. It was like watching an entire town built on top of a sinkhole nobody realized existed. One afternoon, Rachel walked into my house carrying a thick folder and an expression I hadn't and Oppos seen before. Excitement. End quote. You and Oppos, we're not going to believe this. End quote. End quote. Try me. End quote. She dropped the folder on the table. End quote. We found internal emails. End quote. Apparently, a former employee from Ridgeway Communities had become nervous after hearing rumors about our investigation. Through legal channels, Rachel obtained communications showing multiple executives had received warnings years earlier regarding property boundary discrepancies. Not one warning, multiple warnings. Survey concerns, ownership questions, title inconsistencies. They knew there were problems. Maybe not the full extent, but enough to ask questions. Instead of stopping construction, they pushed forward. The room went silent. I stared at the emails for several minutes. There it was. The moment everything changed. Up until then, I thought I was dealing with incompetence. Now it looked like greed. And greed is easier to prove than people realize because greedy people always leave paper trails. Around that same time, Victoria Langford started hearing whispers. Apparently, homeowners were asking questions. Some had noticed survey crews near community boundaries. Others heard rumors from county employees. Victoria called me personally one evening. End quote. Mr. Mercer. End quote. End quote. Victoria. End quote. Her tone was polite. Too polite. End quote. I and Oppos been informed you and Oppos reconducting some sort of investigation. End quote. End quote. Interesting choice of words. End quote. End quote. Can we meet? End quote. I almost laughed. A few months earlier, she and Oppos treated me like a nuisance standing outside the gate. Now she wanted a meeting. Funny how respect appears once leverage changes hands. We met at a coffee shop near the development. Victoria arrived 20 minutes early. I could tell immediately she was worried. The confidence was still there, but cracks had started showing. End quote. Let and Oppos speak honestly, end quote, she said. End quote. What exactly are you trying to accomplish? End quote. I took a sip of coffee. End quote. You mean besides protecting my property? End quote. End quote. Nobody wants litigation. End quote. End quote. You should and Oppos thought about that before building 96 homes on my land. End quote. Her jaw tightened. End quote. The homeowners are innocent. End quote. End quote. I agree. End quote. End quote. Then Don and Oppos punish them. End quote. That statement bothered me because she was right. The residents were innocent. Teachers, nurses, retirees, young families. They and Oppos trusted professionals to do their jobs correctly. They weren't and Oppos villains. They were victims. The problem was that acknowledging their innocence didn't and Oppos magically erase reality. Victoria leaned forward. End quote. What do you want? End quote. There it was again. The same assumption powerful people always make. That every problem has a price tag. That eventually everybody can be bought. End quote. I want accountability. End quote. End quote. Be realistic. End quote. End quote. I am. End quote. End quote. Everybody made mistakes. End quote. I slid a copy of one email across the table. Her face changed instantly. Then another email. Then another. By the time she finished reading, the color had drained from her cheeks. End quote. Where did you get these? End quote. She whispered. I didn't. End Apos. T answer. Because suddenly she understood something important. This wasn't Apos. T a misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't Apos. T a land dispute. This was evidence. Real evidence. The kind that keeps executives awake at night. For nearly 30 seconds neither of us spoke. Finally she looked up. End quote. How many people have seen these? End quote. End quote. Enough? End quote. She sat back slowly. And for the first time since we and Apos met, I saw genuine fear. Not fear of losing an argument. Fear of consequences. Fear that the entire structure supporting Cedar Heights Estates might be far less stable than anyone believed. What Victoria didn't and Apos know was that Rachel had already filed the paperwork. The lawsuit wasn't Apos coming. It was already moving through the system. Multiple defendants, developers, title companies, consultants, corporate officers, several county entities, everyone connected to the approval process. Months of investigation had quietly built toward a single moment. And that moment arrived 3 days later when legal notices started appearing across town. By sunset, executives were calling emergency meetings. Banks were contacting attorneys. Homeowners flooded HOA message boards demanding answers. Local reporters began asking questions. And by the following morning, the story had exploded beyond anything I imagined. Because once the public learned that 96 occupied homes might legally sit on land owned by someone else, the panic became impossible to contain. The panic started before sunrise. By 8:00 and Apos clock that morning, homeowners were standing in driveways holding printed copies of legal notices, arguing with neighbors, calling banks, calling attorneys, calling anyone they thought might have answers. Local news vans lined the entrance to Cedar Heights Estates. Reporters interviewed confused residents near the fountain that once symbolized luxury and now symbolized disaster. Social media exploded. Every version of the story sounded crazier than the last. A mysterious landowner, 96 homes, millions of dollars, potential fraud, corrupt approvals, hidden documents. People couldn't and Apos stopped talking about it because it sounded impossible. The problem was, it was all true. I drove past the entrance later that afternoon and barely recognized the place. A community that had looked calm and successful a few months earlier now felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Homeowners demanded answers from the HOA. The HOA demanded answers from the developer. The developer blamed consultants. Consultants blamed surveyors. Surveyors blamed revised county records. County officials blamed administrative errors. Nobody accepted responsibility because responsibility had become radioactive. The more investigations uncovered, the worse everything looked. Within weeks, multiple independent reviews confirmed what Rachel and Apos' team had already discovered. Critical property records had been altered during the approval process. Boundary concerns had been ignored. Internal warnings had been buried. And perhaps most damaging of all, certain executives had continued selling homes even after receiving documentation questioning ownership status. That single fact changed everything. Mistakes create sympathy. Knowing and proceeding anyway creates outrage. Suddenly the public wasn't and Apos debating whether errors occurred. They were debating how many people knew and how long they had known. One evening Rachel called me while I was eating dinner. End quote. You should probably sit down. End quote. End quote. That sounds promising. End quote. End quote. The developer wants to negotiate. End quote. I almost laughed. End quote. Already? End quote. End quote. They and Apos, re-bleeding money. End quote. She wasn't and Apos, exaggerating. Banks had frozen portions of financing. Several pending home sales collapsed. Investors started distancing themselves. Insurance companies launched reviews. Every day the uncertainty continued. Millions of dollars hung in limbo. The people who once ignored my existence suddenly wanted urgent meetings. We met in a conference room downtown. Around one side of the table sat attorneys, executives, consultants, and representatives connected to the project. Most looked exhausted. Some looked angry. A few looked terrified. Across from them sat Rachel and me. One executive cleared his throat. End quote. Mr. Mercer, We and Oppos. D. About every warning somebody ignored because stopping would have cost too much. Then I answered, end quote, I want every homeowner protected. End quote. Several people exchanged confused looks. End quote. What? End quote. End quote. The residents keep their homes. The families keep their mortgages. Nobody loses their house because of decisions they didn't and Oppos make. End quote. Rachel slid a document across the table. End quote. That and Oppos as condition number 1. End quote. Suddenly the room became very quiet because they expected greed. Instead, they got something far more difficult to argue against. Over the next several months, negotiations continued. Lawsuits expanded. Investigations deepened. Multiple executives resigned. Several professional licenses came under review. Regulatory agencies became involved. The developer and Oppos' reputation collapsed. But eventually, a massive settlement framework emerged. The companies responsible would fund corrective transfers, compensate affected parties, cover legal damages, and establish protections ensuring homeowners retained ownership rights moving forward. The amount involved was enormous. Enough to make national headlines. Enough to bankrupt some people and permanently end careers for others. The final hearing took place nearly a year after I first stood outside that gate. I remember walking into the courthouse and seeing reporters waiting outside. Homeowners filled seats in the gallery. Attorneys carried stacks of documents thick enough to fill small libraries. And sitting there listening to the judge summarize months of findings, I realized something strange. I didn't and Oppos feel victorious. I felt relieved. There and Oppos a difference. Victory is about defeating someone. Relief is about finally ending something that should never have happened in the first place. After the settlement was approved, several homeowners approached me outside. One elderly woman hugged me unexpectedly. A young couple thanked me for refusing to target residents. A veteran who and Oppos purchased one of the homes shook my hand and said, end quote, you could and Oppos burned this whole place down legally, and you didn't and Oppos end quote. Maybe that and Oppos the compliment I and Oppos am proudest of. Because the easiest thing in the world would and Oppos been treating innocent families as leverage. The harder choice was protecting them while still holding the responsible people accountable. A few months later, I visited the old overlook where my grandfather used to sit. The community still existed below. Kids still played in the streets. Families still walked dogs. Life moved forward. The difference was that now the truth sat underneath everything instead of a lie. I scattered the last of Grandpa and Oppos' ashes into the wind and thought about something he once told me. End quote. Land remembers who loves it. End quote. Back then, I thought he was talking about ownership. Now I think he was talking about responsibility. Because ownership is easy to claim. Responsibility is harder. Responsibility means protecting something even when you have the power to destroy it. And that and Oppos' the lesson the people behind Cedar Heights Estates learned too late. They thought land was just another asset, another line on a balance sheet, another opportunity for profit. They forgot that every document represents real people, real families, and real consequences. In the end, they didn't and Oppos lose because I had better lawyers. They lost because the truth eventually caught up with them. And the truth is patient. It doesn't and Oppos rush. It doesn't and Oppos panic. It just waits. So here in Oppos, what I and Oppos love to know from you. If you had discovered 96 homes sitting on land that legally belonged to your family, would you have stopped construction immediately, or would you have done what I did and waited until the entire project was finished before making your move? And do you think the developer deserved a second chance after everything that happened, or were the consequences exactly what justice required? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always reveal where people draw the line between mercy, accountability, and doing what and Oppos' right when innocent people are caught in the middle.